They vanished from history in a single, brutal campaign. 10 entire tribes, millions of people swallowed by the ancient world and never seen again. No graves, no monuments, no final letters home. Just silence stretching across 27 centuries. And yet, somehow, their ghost still haunts every corner of the earth. From the mountains of Afghanistan to the highlands of Ethiopia, from the jungles of India to the plains of America, people have claimed to carry the blood of these lost tribes. Kings have searched for them. Scholars have spent lifetimes hunting their traces. DNA laboratories have tested thousands, hoping to unlock the genetic key to one of history's most enduring puzzles. But here's what no one talks about. Maybe they were never really lost at all. Tonight, we're diving into the mystery that has captivated humanity for nearly 3,000 years. The story of the lost tribes of Israel, a tale that begins with conquest and exile but refuses to end, spreading like wildfire across continents, cultures, and centuries. Because this isn't just ancient history, it's a living mystery that's reshaping identities, redrawing maps, and challenging everything we thought we knew about who we are and where we come from. The year was 721 BCE. The Assyrian war machine had been grinding its way across the ancient Near East for decades, crushing kingdoms like wheat under a millstone. Now they stood before Samaria, capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, ready to deliver the final blow. King Sargon II had perfected the art of conquest. It wasn't enough to simply defeat an enemy, you had to erase them. Strip away their identity, scatter their people to the winds, and make sure they could never rise again. The Assyrians called it deportation. History would remember it as something else entirely, the disappearance of an entire civilization. When the siege ended and the smoke cleared, Sargon's scribes recorded the numbers with clinical precision. 27,290 Israelites, men, women, children, loaded onto carts and marched into the vast expanse of the Assyrian Empire. They were distributed across distant provinces, from the mountains of Media to the cities of Mesopotamia, deliberately scattered so they could never reunite, never remember who they once were. Behind them they left empty cities, abandoned vineyards, and 10 tribal names that would echo through history like a roll call of the disappeared. Asher, Dan, Ephraim, Gad, Issachar, Manasseh, Naphtali, Reuben, Simeon, and Zebulun. These weren't just political units, they were the descendants of Jacob's sons, the inheritors of divine promises, the keepers of ancient traditions that stretched back to Abraham himself. But here's where the story gets complicated. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that the traditional narrative might be incomplete. While the Assyrians did indeed deport thousands, modern excavations reveal that large populations remained behind. Cities like Megiddo and Samaria showed continuity of occupation. Refugees fled south to Judah. Others blended with incoming settlers, creating new hybrid communities. So what really happened to the lost tribes? Did they vanish completely, assimilated into the populations that surrounded them? Or did they survive, carrying their traditions and memories into the shadows of history, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge? The answer depends on who you ask and where you look. Fast forward to the mountains of Ethiopia, where a community called the Beta Israel has practiced Judaism for over 2,000 years. They call themselves the House of Israel, claiming descent from the tribe of Dan. Their traditions speak of ancient migrations, of Jewish ancestors who fled persecution and found refuge in the highlands of Africa. For centuries they lived in isolation, following religious practices that seemed frozen in time. No Talmud, no rabbinical commentaries, just the Torah, and traditions passed down through generations. They observed the Sabbath, practiced ritual purity, and maintained dietary laws that bore striking similarities to ancient Israelite customs. But when geneticists finally tested their DNA, the results were unexpected. The Beta Israel showed closer genetic relationships to their Ethiopian neighbors, than to other Jewish populations. Their ancestry appeared to be primarily African, with limited Middle Eastern input. Yet somehow, they had preserved Jewish religious practices with remarkable fidelity. How do you explain that? How does a community maintain Jewish identity for millennia without genetic connection to ancient Israel? The Beta Israel story challenges our assumptions about what it means to be descended from the lost tribes. Is it about blood, belief, or something else entirely? The mystery deepens when you travel to northeastern India, where the Bnei Menashe claim descent from the tribe of Manasseh. Their story begins in 1951, when a tribal leader reported a dream that changed everything. In that vision, he saw his people's ancient homeland, and it was Israel. The Bnei Menashe had been largely Christian, but suddenly they began embracing Jewish practices with startling enthusiasm. They studied Hebrew, observed Jewish holidays, and petitioned Israeli authorities for recognition as descendants of a lost tribe. Their traditional stories spoke of an ancestor named Manmassi, which they connected to the biblical Manasseh. But once again, genetics told a different story. DNA testing revealed no clear Middle Eastern ancestry. The scientific evidence suggested they were indigenous to their region, with no genetic link to ancient Israel. Yet their commitment to their newfound Jewish identity never wavered. Even more intriguing was the response from Israeli religious authorities. Despite the genetic evidence, or perhaps because of it, Chief Rabbi Shlomo Amar officially recognized the Bnei Menashe as descendants of a lost tribe in 2005. Thousands have since immigrated to Israel, settling in areas from the West Bank to cities near Gaza. This raises a profound question. If genetic testing can't prove lost tribe ancestry, what can? And why do communities across the globe continue to claim these ancient connections? The answer might lie in the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan, among the Pashtun tribes. Here, 25 million people practice strict Sunni Islam, many associated with the Taliban. On the surface, they seem like the last place you'd look for lost Jewish tribes. But dig deeper, and the connections become impossible to ignore. Pashtun tribal names bear striking resemblances to ancient Israelite tribes: Reubeni, Gadi, Ashuri, Ephridi, Shinwari, Lawani, Yusefzai. Their customs include circumcision on the 8th day, women lighting candles on Friday nights, and even maintaining cities of refuge as mandated by biblical law. Many Pashtuns have oral traditions claiming descent from ancient Israel. They speak of ancestors who migrated from the West, carrying with them the customs of a distant homeland. Some even claim to trace their lineage back to King Saul of Israel. Yet once again, genetic studies have failed to substantiate these claims. Despite the cultural evidence, DNA analysis shows no clear Middle Eastern ancestry among the Pashtuns. They appear to be indigenous to their region, with genetic ties to other Central Asian populations. This pattern repeats across the globe. The Lemba people of southern Africa carry traditions of Jewish ancestry and practice customs that echo ancient Israelite law. Initial genetic studies seem to support their claims, revealing high frequencies of Middle Eastern Y chromosome markers, including the Cohen modal haplotype associated with the Jewish priesthood. But more recent, higher resolution analysis has complicated this picture. While the Lemba clearly have Middle Eastern ancestry, the specific connection to ancient Israelites remains uncertain. The genetic evidence suggests a more complex history involving Arab traders and other Semitic populations, not necessarily the lost tribes of Israel. So what are we to make of all these claims? Why do communities across 6 continents insist they carry the blood of ancient Israel? Why do genetic tests consistently fail to confirm what oral traditions and cultural practices seem to suggest? The answer might be simpler than we think and more profound than we ever imagined, because maybe the question isn't whether these communities are genetically descended from the lost tribes. Maybe the question is whether the lost tribes were ever really lost at all. Consider this. What if the lost tribes didn't disappear in a single moment of deportation? What if they dispersed gradually, carrying their stories and traditions like seeds scattered by wind? Some took root in foreign soil, adapted to new climates, and grew into something recognizably different yet fundamentally connected to their origins. The Samaritans might hold the key to understanding this mystery. While the world searched for exotic lost tribes in distant lands, a small community continued living in the shadow of ancient Samaria, insisting they never left at all. They claimed descent from the tribes of Ephraim, Manasseh, and Levi, the very peoples supposedly carried away by the Assyrians. For centuries, their neighbors dismissed them as pretenders, corrupted remnants of a once pure faith. But when geneticists finally studied Samaritan DNA, they discovered something extraordinary. The Samaritans showed clear genetic connections to other Jewish populations, particularly the Kohanim, the hereditary priesthood. Their Y chromosomes told a story of ancient Middle Eastern ancestry, preserved through millennia of strict endogamy. Here was proof that at least some Israelites had survived the Assyrian conquest, maintaining their identity in their ancestral homeland for over 27 centuries. The Samaritans weren't lost at all, they had been hiding in plain sight, dismissed by a world that preferred its mysteries exotic and distant. This revelation forces us to reconsider everything. If some tribes survived in place, what happened to the others? Did they truly vanish, or did they follow different paths of preservation? The answer might lie in understanding how identity travels through time. When the Assyrians scattered the Israelites across their empire, they inadvertently created something unprecedented, a diaspora before diaspora was even a concept. Small groups of displaced Israelites found themselves in Babylon, Media, and beyond, carrying with them not just their physical presence but their stories, their laws, their sense of being chosen. Some assimilated completely, their Israelite identity dissolving into the cultures that absorbed them. But others held on, passing down fragments of memory from parent to child, generation after generation. A story here, a custom there, a name that echoed ancient tribal affiliations. These weren't complete traditions, they were cultural DNA, scattered pieces of a shattered whole. This explains the pattern we see repeated across the globe. Communities that claim lost tribe ancestry aren't necessarily lying or deluded. They might be carrying genuine fragments of Israelite memory, preserved through countless generations of oral transmission. The genetic evidence doesn't disprove their claims, it simply reveals that identity and biology don't always align. Consider the implications. If cultural memory can survive without genetic continuity, then the lost tribes might exist not as discrete populations but as scattered influences, embedded within dozens of communities across multiple continents. The Afghan Pashtun who circumcises his son on the 8th day might be following a custom that originated in ancient Israel, even if his DNA shows no Middle Eastern ancestry. The Ethiopian Beta Israel, who maintains ancient Jewish practices, might be preserving traditions that arrived through trade routes, missionary activity, or small-scale migration events that left little genetic trace but profound cultural impact. The Indian Bnei Menashe, who dreams of returning to Israel, might be responding to cultural memories that have been dormant for centuries, suddenly awakening in response to modern circumstances. This scattered preservation explains another puzzling phenomenon: why lost tribe claims intensified dramatically in the modern era. As global communication improved and Jewish history became more widely known, communities with fragmentary traditions began connecting their local customs to the larger narrative of Israelite dispersion. The process accelerated after the establishment of Israel in 1948. Suddenly, lost tribe identity became more than academic curiosity. It became a potential pathway to citizenship, recognition, and return. Communities that had preserved vague memories of ancient connections began actively researching their histories, seeking validation for claims that had simmered beneath the surface for generations. But this modern awakening has created new complications. How do you verify traditions that have been filtered through centuries of retelling? How do you separate genuine cultural preservation from wishful thinking or opportunistic identity construction? The scientific approach has been to rely on genetics, assuming that DNA would provide objective answers to subjective questions. But the results have been consistently frustrating. Genetic studies reveal complex patterns of migration, admixture, and population movement that rarely align with simple narratives of tribal descent. This shouldn't surprise us. Human populations are fluid, dynamic entities that merge, split, and reform across time. The idea that distinct tribal groups could maintain genetic integrity across nearly 3 millennia of history defies everything we know about population dynamics. Even Jewish populations that maintained strong cultural continuity show evidence of admixture with local populations wherever they settled. What genetics can tell us is different but equally fascinating. It reveals the deep interconnectedness of human populations across the ancient world. The Middle Eastern genetic markers found among various African, Asian, and European populations don't necessarily prove lost tribe ancestry, but they do demonstrate that people, ideas, and traditions moved across vast distances in the ancient world. These genetic traces might represent not the movement of entire tribes, but the cumulative effect of countless individual journeys, merchants, soldiers, refugees, and adventurers who carried Middle Eastern ancestry and cultural knowledge to distant lands. Over time, these scattered influences could have coalesced into communities that preserved fragments of ancient traditions while developing distinct local identities. This model suggests that the search for the lost tribes has been asking the wrong question. Instead of seeking intact tribal populations that maintain their identity across millennia, we should be looking for the cultural echoes and genetic whispers that scattered Israelites left behind as they dispersed across the ancient world. The mystery isn't whether specific communities are descended from the lost tribes. The mystery is how Israelite influence spread so widely that communities on 6 continents develop traditions, customs, and narratives that connect them to ancient Israel. Whether through direct descent, cultural transmission, or parallel development, these communities represent something profound about human memory and identity. They suggest that the lost tribes weren't lost in the way we imagined. They were transformed, scattered like light through a prism, creating a spectrum of identities that reflects the original source while taking on new colors and characteristics. Each claiming community might carry a fragment of truth, not the whole story, but a piece of it, preserved against all odds across the vast span of human history. And if that's true, then the lost tribes aren't a mystery to be solved, but a phenomenon to be understood. They represent the ultimate diaspora, a dispersion so complete and so ancient that its traces have become woven into the fabric of human civilization itself. The question isn't where the lost tribes went. The question is where they didn't go. But the story takes an even stranger turn when we examine what happened in laboratories across the world in the early 21st century. Scientists thought they had found the ultimate tool to settle these ancient debates once and for all: DNA analysis. Finally, they could peer into the genetic code itself and trace bloodlines back through millennia. The results were nothing like anyone expected. In laboratory after laboratory, the same pattern emerged. Communities with the strongest cultural claims to lost tribe ancestry showed the weakest genetic connections to the Middle East. Meanwhile, populations that had never claimed Israelite descent carried genetic markers that suggested ancient connections to the Levant. Take the Lemba people of southern Africa. For generations, they had maintained oral traditions of Jewish ancestry, claiming their forefathers came from a place called Sina in ancient Yemen. They practiced circumcision, observed dietary restrictions, and maintained marriage customs that echoed biblical law. When the first genetic studies were conducted in the 1990 seconds, The results seemed to confirm their claims spectacularly. The Lemba carried high frequencies of a genetic marker called the Cohen modal haplotype, a Y chromosome signature associated with the Jewish priesthood. Among the Buba clan, the traditional leaders of the Lemba, 50% of men carried this ancient priestly marker. It was a higher percentage than found in many established Jewish communities. The scientific community was electrified. Here, finally, was concrete proof that at least one African population carried genuine Jewish ancestry. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and the Lemba became poster children for the power of genetic archaeology. But as DNA analysis became more sophisticated, the picture grew murkier. Higher resolution studies revealed that while the Lemba clearly had Middle Eastern ancestry, the connection to ancient Israelites was far from certain. The genetic evidence was equally consistent with descent from Arab traders who had established extensive commercial networks across the Indian Ocean for over a millennium. More troubling still, some of the genetic markers initially attributed to Jewish ancestry were later found in populations with no historical connection to Israel whatsoever. The Cohen modal haplotype, once thought to be a unique signature of Jewish priesthood, appeared in communities across the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and even parts of Europe. This wasn't fraud or error, it was the messy reality of human genetics. Populations that seem distinct today were interconnected in the ancient world through networks of trade, migration, and conquest that left genetic traces across vast distances. Trying to use these traces to prove specific ancestral claims was like trying to reconstruct a library from scattered pages found across different continents. The genetic revolution that was supposed to solve the mystery of the lost tribes had instead deepened it. Each new study raised more questions than it answered. If genetics couldn't prove lost tribe ancestry, what could? And why did the scientific evidence consistently contradict the cultural claims? Dr. Spencer Wells, a leading population geneticist, put it bluntly, "We're asking genetics to answer questions it simply can't answer. DNA can tell us about population movements and mixing over thousands of years, but it can't tell us about the specific cultural or religious identities of ancient peoples." This revelation forced researchers to confront an uncomfortable truth. The search for the lost tribes had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how identity works. Everyone had assumed that genetic ancestry and cultural identity would align neatly, that DNA would provide objective validation for subjective claims. But human identity is far more complex than genetic inheritance. Culture travels through teaching, not just through breeding. Stories cross ethnic boundaries. Traditions can be adopted, adapted, and passed down through communities that have no genetic connection to their origins. This explains why the most compelling lost tribe claims often came from communities with the weakest genetic evidence. They weren't preserving bloodlines, they were preserving memories. And memories, unlike genes, can survive the complete genetic replacement of a population. Consider what happens when a small group of traders or refugees settles in a distant land. They might intermarry with local populations for generations, their genetic signature diluting until it becomes virtually undetectable. But their stories, their customs, their sense of coming from somewhere else, these can persist, growing stronger rather than weaker as they become central to the community's identity. This process might explain the global distribution of lost tribe claims. Ancient trade routes connected the Middle East to Africa, Asia, and even the Americas. Along these routes, people, goods, and ideas flowed in complex patterns that left cultural deposits far from their origins. A Jewish merchant in ancient Yemen might have shared stories of the 12 tribes with local partners. A group of Israelite refugees might have joined a caravan heading east, their descendants eventually reaching India or Central Asia. Soldiers, diplomats, and adventurers could have carried fragments of Israelite tradition to the furthest corners of the known world. Over time, these cultural seeds could have grown into full-blown traditions of Israelite ancestry, especially in communities that felt marginalized or displaced. The idea of being descended from a chosen people, of carrying ancient divine promises in their blood, provided meaning and dignity to peoples who might otherwise see themselves as forgotten by history. But there's another possibility, one that challenges everything we think we know about the lost tribes. What if they weren't lost through deportation and assimilation? What if they were lost through something far more systematic and far more recent? The traditional narrative assumes that the lost tribes disappeared in ancient times, their identity dissolving in the vast populations of the Assyrian Empire. But what if significant populations of Israelites survived much longer, maintaining their identity through centuries of foreign rule, only to face systematic erasure in later periods? Historical records from the medieval period contain intriguing references to Jewish communities in Central Asia, India, and Africa that claim descent from the ancient tribes of Israel. These weren't vague traditions or wishful thinking, they were living communities with detailed genealogies, ancient texts, and established religious practices. The Khazars, a powerful kingdom in the Caucasus region, famously converted to Judaism in the 8th century. But some scholars argue that this conversion built upon existing Jewish populations that may have included descendants of the lost tribes. The Khazar kingdom maintained Jewish identity for centuries before being conquered and scattered by invading forces. Similar communities existed along the Silk Road, in the mountains of Afghanistan, and in the highlands of Ethiopia. Many maintained detailed oral histories that traced their ancestry back to specific Israelite tribes. They preserved Hebrew texts, followed ancient customs, and maintained networks of communication with Jewish communities in other regions. What happened to these communities? Some were destroyed by conquest, others by persecution. Many were forced to convert to Islam or Christianity to survive. Some were simply absorbed into larger populations through intermarriage and cultural assimilation. But here's the crucial point. Many of these disappearances happened relatively recently, within the last 1,000 years. If substantial populations of lost tribe descendants survived into the medieval period, their cultural memories and genetic signatures might still be detectable in modern populations. This would explain why lost tribe claims are so widespread and persistent. Communities across the globe might be carrying genuine fragments of Israelite ancestry and tradition, not from the ancient Assyrian deportation, but from more recent dispersals of medieval Jewish populations. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation. Rather than finding ancient Middle Eastern ancestry in claiming populations, researchers often find more recent admixture patterns that could reflect medieval migrations and conversions. Consider the implications. If the lost tribes weren't lost in 721 BCE, but survived as identifiable communities well into the medieval period, then their modern descendants might be hiding in plain sight. They might have maintained fragments of their identity even after being forced to adopt new religions or integrate into different cultures. This possibility has profound implications for how we understand Jewish history, Middle Eastern demographics, and the nature of cultural survival under persecution. It suggests that the Jewish diaspora was far more extensive and diverse than traditionally recognized, with communities maintaining Israelite identity in regions where their presence has been largely forgotten by mainstream history. It also explains why the State of Israel has been cautiously receptive to some lost tribe claims while rejecting others. Israeli authorities might recognize patterns in these communities that suggest genuine historical connections, even if the genetic evidence remains ambiguous. The case of the Bnei Menashe is instructive. Despite lacking clear genetic evidence of Middle Eastern ancestry, thousands have been permitted to immigrate to Israel and settle in contested territories. This suggests that Israeli authorities see strategic or cultural value in these communities that transcends purely genealogical considerations. But it also raises troubling questions about the politicization of lost tribe claims. When identity becomes a pathway to citizenship, recognition, and land rights, the stakes of verification rise dramatically. Communities might emphasize or even fabricate connections to ancient Israel to gain access to opportunities otherwise denied to them. This instrumentalization of identity has turned the search for the lost tribes into something approaching a modern gold rush. Communities across the developing world have begun claiming Israelite ancestry with increasing frequency, often with the explicit goal of gaining recognition from Israeli authorities. The phenomenon has created a cottage industry of genealogical entrepreneurs, DNA testing services, and cultural consultants who help communities construct compelling narratives of lost tribe descent. Some of these efforts are genuine attempts to recover forgotten history. Others are transparent attempts at identity manipulation for political or economic gain. The line between authentic cultural recovery and opportunistic identity construction has become increasingly blurred. How do you distinguish between a community that has preserved genuine traditions for centuries and one that has recently adopted Jewish practices based on modern research and wishful thinking? The answer might be that the distinction itself is meaningless. Identity is always constructed, always evolving, always responsive to changing circumstances. The communities claiming lost tribe ancestry today might be creating new forms of Israelite identity rather than recovering ancient ones, and there might be nothing wrong with that. What matters isn't whether these communities can prove unbroken descent from ancient Israel, but whether their claims represent meaningful attempts to connect with larger narratives of human meaning and purpose. The lost tribes have become a symbol of displacement, survival, and the hope for eventual return themes that resonate with marginalized communities worldwide. In this sense, the lost tribes are not a historical puzzle to be solved, but a living metaphor that continues to generate new meanings and new identities. Every community that claims descent from the ancient tribes of Israel is participating in an ongoing process of cultural creation that began nearly 3,000 years ago and shows no signs of ending. The mystery isn't where the lost tribes went, it's where they continue to go. Each new claim, each genetic study, each recognition or rejection by authorities adds another chapter to a story that refuses to reach its conclusion. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The lost tribes were never meant to be found. They were meant to remain lost, scattered across the world like seeds of possibility, taking root wherever human beings feel displaced, forgotten, or in search of a deeper connection to the sacred currents of history. They are the eternal mystery because they represent something eternal in human nature, the need to belong, to matter, to be part of something larger than ourselves. Whether they exist as genetic reality or cultural metaphor might be less important than the fact that they continue to exist at all in the hearts and minds of people who refuse to accept that any tribe, any people, any part of the human family can ever be truly lost. In laboratories around the world, scientists stare at computer screens displaying genetic maps that look like abstract art swirling patterns of ancestry that tell stories no one expected to hear. The data points scatter across charts like stars in an unfamiliar constellation, each one representing thousands of years of human movement, mixing, and survival. Dr. Sarah Chen runs her finger across one such display at Stanford University's genetics lab. The sample belongs to a man from Kerala, India, whose grandmother insisted their family descended from the tribe of Ephraim. The genetic markers tell a different story, one of Portuguese colonists, local Dravidian populations, and traces of ancestry from the Arabian Peninsula. No clear path back to ancient Israel. But there's something else in the data, something that makes Dr. Chen pause. Embedded within this man's genetic code are fragments that appear nowhere else in the Indian subcontinent. They're too old to be from recent migration, too specific to be random mutations. They whisper of journeys taken long before recorded history, of populations that moved across continents carrying secrets in their very cells. This is the new frontier of lost tribe research, not the search for intact populations, but the hunt for genetic ghosts. Scientists are discovering that human migration patterns were far more complex than anyone imagined. The ancient world wasn't divided into neat tribal territories with clear boundaries. It was a web of interconnected communities, constantly exchanging people, ideas, and DNA across vast distances. Consider the Silk Road, that famous network of trade routes connecting east and west. For over 1,000 years, it carried more than silk and spices. It carried people, merchants, soldiers, diplomats, refugees, and adventurers flowed along these routes like blood through arteries, leaving genetic traces that still surface in modern populations. DNA extracted from ancient burial sites along the Silk Road reveals astonishing diversity. A single cemetery in Kazakhstan contains remains showing ancestry from Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and East Asia, all buried together, suggesting these weren't separate populations but integrated communities where intermarriage was common. Now imagine small groups of displaced Israelites joining these ancient highways of human movement. They wouldn't have traveled as cohesive tribes maintaining their identity across centuries. They would have merged, adapted, and contributed their genetic heritage to the great mixing bowl of Eurasian migration. Their descendants might show up today not as clearly identifiable lost tribes, but as unexpected genetic signatures in populations thousands of miles from Israel. That Portuguese Indian man's mysterious DNA fragments might indeed carry echoes of ancient Israel, not through direct tribal descent, but through the complex web of human connection that has bound our species together since the dawn of civilization. This realization has forced researchers to completely reconceptualize their search. Instead of looking for the lost tribes, they're now mapping what scientists call cryptic ancestry, genetic influences that are too ancient and diluted to show up in standard analyses, but still leave detectable traces in the right circumstances. The technology to detect these traces is advancing at breakneck speed. Whole genome sequencing can now identify genetic influences that represent less than 1% of a person's ancestry. Ancient DNA analysis can extract genetic information from bones thousands of years old. Machine learning algorithms can spot patterns in genetic data that would take human researchers decades to identify. These tools are revealing that the question, "Where are the lost tribes?" might be fundamentally wrong. The right question might be, "Where aren't they?" So here we stand, 27 centuries later, still asking the same question that has haunted humanity since the gates of Samaria fell silent. The lost tribes refuse to be found because they were never meant to be found as we imagined them intact, preserved, waiting in some distant valley for rediscovery. They live instead as fragments scattered across the human story, embedded in our genes, our traditions, our deepest longings for connection and belonging. Whether carried in DNA too ancient to decode or memories too precious to abandon, they remind us that no people, no story, no part of our shared human family can ever truly vanish. The mystery endures because we endure still searching, still hoping, still believing that somewhere in the vast tapestry of human experience, the lost can always find their way home.